Staff Sergeant Elena Vance slipped into the back row of the Tactical Operations Center at Forward Operating Base Cobra as the morning briefing began. The August heat already pressed through the prefabricated walls, and she positioned herself beside two other support personnel against the rear wall. 16 Rangers filled the forward seats, their digital camouflage uniforms crisp despite the early hour. Ranger Staff Sergeant Marcus Dalton stood at the front beside a topographical map of Coast Valley, his pointer tapping against the laminated surface. "We roll out at 1,400 hours, he announced. Primary route follows the main supply road through the valley floor, then northeast toward the village clusters. His finger traced the red line, marking their intended path. Vance studied the map from her position 30 feet back. The route passed within 400 meters of a ridgeline she recognized from a previous medical evacuation run. That elevated position offered clear observation over the entire valley floor, and she had noted fighting positions carved into the rocky face during the helicopter approach 2 weeks prior. "The patrol will establish overwatch at Checkpoint 7, Dalton continued, his confidence filling the room as he detailed timing and personnel assignments. "Chun and Brooks will handle the northern approach, while Martinez covers our 6. Standard patrol protocols apply." Vance raised her hand. The movement caught Dalton's attention mid-sentence, and his eyes narrowed as he recognized the Medical Corps insignia on her uniform. His pointer lowered to his side. "Staff Sergeant, that route passes close to an observation post on the eastern ridge," Vance said. "During the medevac flight on August 3rd, I observed prepared fighting positions approximately 400 meters from your plant track." Dalton's jaw tightened. "Medical stays in the medical lane," he said. The 3 Rangers nearest him turned in their seats, Chun smirking while Brooks exchanged a knowing glance with Martinez. The dismissal landed like a physical barrier between the front of the room and Vance's position. "I understand, but the tactical concern is the elevation advantage," Vance pressed. "Those positions offer direct line of sight to your entire route through the valley floor. We're Rangers." Dalton cut her off, his hand gesture sharp and final. "You're a nurse. Different worlds, different expertise." His tone carried the weight of absolute certainty, and several heads nodded throughout the room. Captain Morrison sat in the front row, his focus remaining on the map rather than the exchange. The Ranger officer in charge made no move to intervene or acknowledge Vance's observation. His silence validated Dalton's dismissal more effectively than words could have. "As I was saying before the interruption," Dalton resumed, his emphasis on the final word drawing quiet chuckles from the assembled Rangers. "Checkpoint 7 provides optimal positioning for our objectives. Questions relevant to this operation?" 3 hands rose from the Ranger section, none from a back row, where support personnel maintained their expected silence. Vance remained standing for another moment, then lowered herself back against the wall. The briefing continued for another 12 minutes, covering communications protocols, emergency extraction points, and ammunition loads. Morrison added brief comments about rules of engagement and stressed the importance of civilian interaction protocols in the target villages. When Dalton concluded the briefing, the Rangers filed out in groups of 3 and 4, their conversation energetic as they discussed patrol preparations. Shin passed within 2 feet of Vance on his way to the exit. "Medical trying to run missions now," he said to Brooks, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry. "What's next?" "Supplies sergeants planning airstrikes." Brooks laughed, and the 2 men disappeared through the doorway into the blinding sunlight beyond. Vance gathered her notebook and moved toward the exit. Morrison had already left, and Dalton stood reviewing his map with 2 junior Rangers. Their discussion focused on patrol timing rather than terrain concerns. The observation post on the ridge had been noted, documented in her mind during that medevac flight when the helicopter banked over the valley. She had watched the prepared positions through the open door, their strategic value obvious even from 1,500 feet. The aid station waited 300 meters across the base compound, its climate control system fighting a losing battle against the Afghan summer. Vance had 4 hours until the Rangers departed, for hours of routine sick call and minor injury treatment. The terrain concern she had raised would go with them into Coast Valley, unaddressed and unconsidered. Every base operates on assumptions, she thought as she crossed the dusty path between buildings. Every unit develops blind spots based on who they believe deserves input and who should remain quietly in their assigned role. The Rangers saw medical insignia and concluded her observations held no tactical value. Vance reached the aid station door and paused, looking back toward the operations center. The morning briefing had established the boundaries clearly. Different worlds, Dalton had said. Different expertise. She pulled open the door and stepped into the artificial cool of the medical facility. Specialist Hayes sat in the waiting area, his hand wrapped in gauze from a minor training injury that needed evaluation before the afternoon patrol. The ridge observation post remained 400 meters from the planned route. The prepared fighting positions remained carved into the elevated terrain, and the Rangers remained confident in their assessment that a nurse had nothing relevant to contribute. Vance set her notebook on the desk and pulled on examination gloves to treat Hayes. Some lessons, she knew from experience, require more than words to teach. Where are you watching from tonight? The assumptions we make about the people around us often say more about our limitations than theirs. Drop your state or country in the comments. For hours until the patrol departed. For hours until Coast Valley swallowed 16 Rangers who had never asked why a nurse might notice tactical terrain. Specialist Hayes extended his injured hand across the examination table. The gauze wrap darkened with dried blood from shrapnel fragment that had caught him during yesterday's patrol near the northern perimeter. Vance unwrapped the dressing with practiced efficiency, her movements economical as she assessed the wound's healing progress. The fragment came in at a shallow angle, Hayes said as she cleaned the area with antiseptic. Probably ricochet off the concrete barrier. Hit 3 of us in about 2 seconds. Vance noted the entry point and trajectory. Incoming fire from the northeast ridgeline, approximately 400 meters out. The wounds cluster together because the shooter was working a specific field of fire, not random spray. Hayes pulled his hand back slightly, studying her face. You notice weird stuff for a medic, he said. Most medical just asks if it hurts and wraps it back up. Pattern recognition matters in trauma care, Vance replied, applying fresh gauze. Helps predict complications. She secured the dressing and released his hand. Keep it dry for another 48 hours, then normal duty. Hayes stood and flexed his fingers, testing the wrap's tightness. Thanks, document. He moved toward the exit, his curiosity apparently satisfied by her clinical explanation. The aid station fell quiet after his departure. Vance disposed of the contaminated materials and sanitized the examination area, her mind returning to the morning briefing and the ridgeline that Dalton had dismissed. The prepared positions she had observed from the medevac helicopter were deliberate construction, not random cover. Someone had invested time carving those fighting positions into solid rock. The door opened again 20 minutes later. Lieutenant Sarah Kim entered carrying a medical records folder, her logistics officer uniform bearing the creases of someone who had been working since before dawn. Routine check before I rotate stateside next month, she said, settling into the examination chair. Vance reviewed Kim's file, noting the absence of any significant medical concerns during her 15-month deployment. Blood pressure normal. Vision check standard. The examination proceeded through the required elements with professional efficiency. Kim watched Vance work with the attention of someone accustomed to analyzing systems and people. You keep your trauma equipment more organized than most field hospitals, she observed. Everything staged by usage priority rather than alphabetical or size. Old habits from previous assignments, Vance said without elaboration. She completed the vision test and marked the results in Kim's file. The lieutenant's gaze shifted to the corner where Vance's M4 rifle stood in its rack, the weapon maintained to a standard that exceeded medical corps requirements. The rifle showed evidence of recent cleaning, its surfaces free of the fine dust that coated everything else on the base within hours of maintenance. You maintain your weapon like infantry, Kim said. Most medical personnel treat it like required equipment they hope never to use. Vance returned the rifle to its position after every shift, breaking it down completely and inspecting each component. "Some habits you don't lose," she replied. "Prior service teaches certain standards." Kim leaned forward slightly. "What kind of prior service?" "Your file just lists nursing school after initial enlistment." The question hung between them for 3 seconds before Vance deflected with practiced ease. "Different branch, different time. Retrained as a nurse after my first contract ended." The radio on Vance's desk crackled with patrol departure updates. "Ranger element departing main gate at 1,405 hours, a voice announced. "Route Cobra through Coast Valley. Estimated return 1,900 hours. Kim noticed the shift in Vance's expression, subtle but present. "You're concerned about that patrol," she said. Statement rather than question. Vance checked the wall clock showing 1,403 hours. The route passes near terrain that offers significant tactical advantage to anyone positioned there. "I mentioned it in the briefing this morning, and they dismissed you," Kim said. She had witnessed enough briefing room dynamics during her deployment to recognize the pattern without needing details. "Medical stays in the medical lane," Vance quoted Dalton's words without inflection. She moved to the supply cabinet and began inventory count, her hands moving through boxes of gauze and bandages with mechanical precision. Kim remained seated, her evaluation complete, but her departure delayed by curiosity and something else. Growing respect, perhaps, or recognition of capability that extended beyond job description. "I've noticed you see things others miss," she said. "The trauma staging, the weapon maintenance, the tactical observations. That's not standard nursing school curriculum." Vance paused in her inventory count, a box of pressure dressings held between her hands. Sometimes the best preparation for saving lives is understanding how lives get threatened. She returned the box to its precise position and turned to face Kim directly. "Every person in this base has skills beyond their current job title. The question is whether anyone asks before assuming they know our full capability." The statement carried weight beyond its surface meaning, and Kim absorbed it with the careful attention of someone who documented patterns for living. She stood and collected her medical file. "Thanks for the evaluation. And for what it's worth, terrain concerns from someone who actually looks at terrain seem more valuable than confidence from someone who doesn't want input." Vance signed off on Kim's medical clearance. "Safe travels stateside, Lieutenant." Kim moved toward the door, then stopped at the threshold. "If you're right about that ridgeline," she said, "today's going to be difficult. If you're wrong, Dalton will never let you forget it. Either way, you tried." The door closed behind her, and Vance was alone again with her precisely organized equipment and the radio broadcasting routine traffic updates. The patrol had entered Coast Valley 3 minutes ago, 16 Rangers following the route that passed within 400 meters of elevated observation posts that no one had considered worth addressing. She returned to her inventory, counting supplies and restocking trauma kits that might be needed depending on how the afternoon developed. Her M4 stood in its corner rack, cleaned and maintained to standards that drew questions but never real inquiry into why a nurse approached weapons with infantry discipline. Prior service, she had told Kim. The phrase covered years of training and deployment without revealing specifics. Marine Corps Infantry, 2 combat tours, marksmanship instructor qualified before separating and choosing a different path forward. A path that led to nursing school, Army enlistment, and assignment to this forward operating base where Rangers dominated tactical discussions and medical personnel were expected to remain quiet in their designated lane. Vance completed her inventory count and sat at her desk. The radio continued its steady stream of traffic updates, patrol position reports, and routine communications that formed the background rhythm of base operations. 400 meters from elevated fighting positions. 400 meters from prepared observation points that she had seen clearly from a helicopter door during a medical evacuation flight that Dalton had never asked about. The afternoon heat intensified beyond the aid station walls. Somewhere in Coast Valley, the patrol moved through terrain that offered advantages to anyone positioned to exploit them. And here in the climate-controlled medical facility, a nurse who noticed tactical details maintained her readiness for whatever the next few hours might demand. Some skills you don't lose, she had told Kim. Some observations you can't ignore, even when no one wants to hear them. The prepared fighting positions remained exactly where Vance had documented them 2 weeks ago. The Rangers remained confident in their dismissal of her warning, and the afternoon continued its slow progression toward evening, toward patrol return time, toward whatever lessons the valley might teach about assumptions and expertise. Dusk settled over forward operating base Cobra at 1847 hours, the Afghan summer heat finally releasing its grip as shadows stretched across the compound. The Ranger Patrol returned through the main gate in their armored vehicles, dust trailing behind them like a statement of completion. Vance watched from the aid station window as Dalton dismounted from the lead vehicle, his stride confident as he crossed toward the operations center. He passed within 20 feet of the medical facility, close enough that Vance saw the smirk cross his face when he noticed her at the window. Terrain looked fine. "Nurse," he called out, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone vindicated by an uneventful patrol. Chun and Martinez laughed behind him, their weapons slung casually over shoulders as they moved toward the barracks for post-patrol procedures. Vance turned from the window and returned to her desk, where medical logs waited for end-of-day completion. The patrol had returned intact, her warning proven unnecessary by the absence of contact. Dalton would remember this, would use it as confirmation that medical personnel should restrict their observations to medical concerns. She documented the day's minor treatments in precise handwriting, each entry noting injury type, treatment provided, and return tragedy status. Hayes with his shrapnel wound healing normally. Kim with her routine pre-deployment evaluation complete. 3 other soldiers with minor ailments requiring nothing more than over-the-counter medications and rest recommendations. The radio on her desk maintained its steady background traffic. Patrol Element Cobra 6 returning to base, all personnel accounted for. Standard evening reports from perimeter observation posts, noting nothing unusual in their sectors. The rhythm of routine that characterized most days in a forward operating base, where weeks of monotony were occasionally punctured by brief moments of violence. At 1855 hours, Vance heard the sound. It came from beyond the perimeter, distant but distinct. Engine noise. Multiple vehicles moving in loose coordination rather than the random pattern of civilian traffic on the surrounding roads. Her hand stopped mid-sentence in her medical log as she focused on identifying the specific acoustic signature. 3 vehicles minimum, she assessed. Diesel engines, older models based on the irregular firing pattern, moving toward the base from different approach vectors rather than a single road. The sound triggered recognition from her previous experience, pattern matching against dozens of similar approaches she had heard during deployments when coordination meant hostile intent. Vance stood and moved to the aid station door, opening it to eliminate the barrier between her ears and the sound source. The engine noise continued building, now joined by a second approach from the northwest sector. 2 separate elements converging, their timing suggesting deliberate coordination rather than coincidence. She reached for her radio, but hesitated. Reporting engine sounds based on pattern recognition would draw the same dismissal as her morning terrain warning, perhaps worse given Dalton's recent vindication in Coast Valley. The perimeter guards would report actual threats when they materialized into something more concrete than diesel engines in the distance. The explosion hit the southeast perimeter at 19:02 hours. The blast wave reached the aid station 3 seconds after the initial flash, rattling the prefabricated walls and sending 2 metal instrument trays crashing from their shelf positions. The base alarm system activated immediately, its piercing tone cutting through the evening air as radio traffic erupted with urgent status reports. Southeast Tower reporting vehicle-borne IED at perimeter wall, a voice shouted through the radio static. Multiple casualties, vehicle penetrated outer barrier. Vance grabbed her trauma kit and rifle in a single practice motion, the movements automatic as she processed the tactical situation developing around her. She pushed through the aid station door and ran toward the southeast casualty collection point, her boots pounding against the dirt path as other personnel emerged from buildings throughout the compound. The second explosion struck the northwest tower before she had covered 50 meters. The blast came from the opposite side of the base, its timing and placement confirming what the engine sounds had suggested. Coordinated assault, multiple entry points, deliberate planning to split defensive response between separated sectors. Vance altered her direction toward the nearer northwest position where casualties would be more immediate. Radio traffic intensified with overlapping transmissions. Northwest tower hit, structure partially collapsed. Need medical to both locations. All combat personnel to defensive positions. The voices carried controlled urgency rather than panic, training overriding the shock of simultaneous attacks. Vance reached the northwest casualty point, where 3 soldiers lay in various states of injury, the closest being dragged away from burning debris by 2 other personnel. She dropped to her knees beside the most severely wounded, her hands already assessing injuries while her mind tracked the broader tactical situation through sound and radio traffic. All Ranger elements to northwest defensive position, Dalton's voice commanded through the radio. Heavy fire from ridgeline, approximately 400 meters out. Multiple shooters, prepare positions. The words penetrated Vance's focus even as she applied pressure to ephemeral bleed. The ridgeline, 400 meters. Prepared positions. Every element she had identified in the morning briefing, now vindicated not by her being right, but by Rangers being engaged from exactly the terrain she had warned about. She worked through the casualty with practiced efficiency, stabilizing the worst bleeds and marking him for immediate evacuation before moving to the next wounded soldier. The trauma procedures occupied her hands while her tactical awareness processed the evolving battle through radio transmissions and the distinctive sounds of small arms fire from multiple directions. All Ranger elements pinned at northwest position, unable to maneuver, a new voice reported. Insurgents attempting flank through Western Gap. Estimate 6 personnel advancing toward undefended sector. Vance completed pressure bandage application on her second casualty and looked up at the base layout around her. The Western Gap sat 40 meters from her current position, a section of perimeter between defensive positions that relied on interlocking fields of fire from adjacent towers. With both towers engaged or damaged, the gap offered an uncontested entry point directly into the base interior. She stood and scanned the gap area. No defenders visible, no personnel moving to cover the vulnerability. Everyone who could fight had rushed to the 2 blast sites or reinforced the positions taking direct fire. The Western Gap remained open because it had seemed irrelevant until attackers demonstrated understanding of the base's defensive layout. Vance grabbed her rifle and moved toward the gap at a run. She keyed her radio while crossing the open ground. Western Gap uncovered, I have position, engaging. The response came from Morrison in the Tactical Operations Center. Who is this? The captain's voice carried confusion rather than recognition. Vance reached the concrete barrier marking the gap's defensive line and dropped into position behind it. She didn't answer Morrison's question, her focus shifting to the terrain beyond the perimeter where 6 figures moved through the dim light, their advance coordinated as they exploited the undefended sector. She acquired the lead insurgent in her sights at 147 meters, the distance precisely judged through familiarity with the M4's ballistic characteristics. The prepared fighting positions on the ridgeline continued pouring fire into the Ranger positions to her right, their muzzle flashes visible in the gathering darkness. The 6-man element advancing on her position believed they faced an open door into the base interior. Vance controlled her breathing and pressed the trigger. The lead insurgent dropped, and the assault on forward operating base Cobra transformed from a coordinated breach into a desperate fight for survival that would test every assumption about who could hold a defensive line under fire. The lead insurgent collapsed at 147 meters, his body dropping into the dust as the remaining 5 scattered toward available cover. Vance transitioned smoothly to her secondary position 3 meters left, the movement practiced and efficient as she acquired her next target through the M4's optic. The clock in her mind marked 19:08 hours as she settled behind the second firing position. 13 minutes until the Quick Reaction Force helicopter could arrive from the regional hub, assuming immediate scramble and direct flight. 13 minutes to hold this 40-meter gap against an enemy element that now understood someone defended what they had expected to find open. Return fire snapped overhead as the insurgents identified her position. Rounds impacted the concrete barrier with sharp cracks, throwing fragments of stone and dust into the air around her. Vance remained below the barrier's protection, counting the incoming shots and identifying firing positions by sound and muzzle flash pattern. 2 shooters from the drainage ditch at 120 meters, 1 behind the disabled vehicle at 90 meters, 2 more spread among the rocks at 130 meters. The 6th insurgent had disappeared after her first shot, either wounded or seeking better cover in the failing light. She rose just enough to clear the barrier's edge and fired a controlled pair at the nearest threat. The insurgent behind the vehicle jerked backward, his weapon falling across the hood as he collapsed. 4 confirmed threats remaining, their fire now concentrated on her position with increased intensity. Western sector taking heavy fire. She transmitted between engagements. Enemy attempting to maintain pressure on gap. Who the hell is on Western sector? Dalton's voice demanded through the radio traffic. They're keeping the flank closed. Vance dropped below the barrier as a burst of automatic fire chewed across its top edge. She counted 3 seconds, then transitioned back to her primary position and engaged the drainage ditch. Her first shot missed high. The second caught the insurgent in the shoulder, spinning him away from his weapon. The second shooter in the ditch pulled his wounded companion deeper into cover. 3 effective combatants remaining in immediate threat range. The insurgents adjusted their tactics, no longer attempting to advance, but instead maintaining suppressive fire to fix her position while they maneuvered. Smart response from experienced fighters who recognized their numerical advantage meant nothing if they couldn't exploit the gap she defended alone. Morrison's voice cut through the radio chaos at 1913 hours. I have visual on Western position. His transmission carried disbelief. That's Vance. The nurse? Vance fired again, her round striking the rocks where 2 insurgents had taken position. They returned fire immediately, their shots forcing her to duck as concrete fragments stung her exposed neck. She wiped dust from her face and checked her ammunition count. 22 rounds remaining in the current magazine, 3 full magazines in her vest pouches. The ridgeline position that had engaged the Rangers continued its separate attack, the 2 assault elements operating independently, but with obvious coordination. The base's defensive response remained split between multiple crisis points, exactly as the attackers had planned. Only the Western Gap had failed to provide the easy entry they expected. At 1915 hours, 3 insurgents attempted a coordinated rush. They broke from cover simultaneously, 2 from the drainage ditch and 1 from the rocks, their movement designed to overwhelm a single defender through speed and multiple angles of approach. Vance engaged the nearest threat first, dropping him at 80 meters with 2 rapid shots. She pivoted to the second rusher, her sight picture settling on center mass as she pressed the trigger. He stumbled and fell at 75 meters. The third insurgent reached 60 meters before her next shot caught him in the leg, sending him sprawling into the dirt where he crawled desperately back toward the drainage ditch. Her breathing remained controlled, her heart rate elevated but manageable. The muscle memory from years of infantry training overrode the adrenaline surge that could degrade accuracy under stress. Each movement economical, each shot deliberate, each transition between positions executed with practiced efficiency. The wounded insurgent reached the ditch and disappeared into its protective depth. Vance used the pause to reload, her hands performing the magazine change automatically while her eyes scanned for new threats. The firing from the ridgeline intensified, suggesting the Rangers remained pinned and unable to provide supporting fire to other sectors. Morrison's voice returned at 1917 hours, his transmission directed at the operations center rather than the tactical net. She's been holding that position for 9 minutes. Alone. The statement carried implications beyond tactical assessment. A new sound cut through the small arms fire. Mortar launch, distinct and unmistakable, the hollow thump of a tube firing somewhere beyond the perimeter. Vance counted seconds, calculating trajectory and impact point based on sound delay and angle. 3 seconds. 4 seconds. 5 seconds. The mortar round hit 8 meters from her primary position. The explosion lifted her from the ground and slammed her against the barrier's base. Her ears rang with sudden deafness, her vision blurred by dust and blast pressure. The M4 had been torn from her grip, and she groped blindly for its familiar shape while her disoriented mind struggled to re-establish spatial awareness. Her hand found a rifle 3 feet to her left. She pulled it close and checked the chamber, confirming the weapon remained functional despite the blast. Blood ran from her nose, warm and metallic in her mouth. Her left arm showed fresh shrapnel wounds, minor cuts that would require attention later, if later existed. Vance pushed herself upright and returned to her firing position. The mortar attack had been poorly aimed, thrown off by darkness and distance, but it demonstrated the insurgents' commitment to breaking through the Western Gap. They understood its tactical value and were willing to expend resources to exploit it. 2 insurgents remained visible, their positions now cautiously withdrawn to ranges exceeding 150 meters. They had learned respect for the defender who had killed 3 of their element and wounded 2 others. Their fire continued, but with less aggression, more focused on suppression than on preparing another assault. The helicopter sound reached Vance's damaged ears at 1920 hours, distant but growing. She identified it as a UH-60 by the rotor signature, the quick reaction force arriving with the speed that came from maximum urgency flight profiles. The aircraft's approach changed the tactical equation completely. The insurgents recognized the sound simultaneously. Their fire slackened, then ceased entirely as they broke contact and withdrew into the darkness beyond the perimeter. The ridgeline position went silent moments later, the coordinated attack dissolving as the attackers recognized their window had closed. Vance remained in position behind the barrier, her rifle still trained on the last known enemy locations. The helicopter passed overhead at 1921 hours, its presence ending the immediate threat but not the defensive requirement. Only when Morrison's voice confirmed all clear over the radio did she finally lower her weapon and check her watch. 13 minutes. From first engagement to enemy withdrawal. 13 minutes holding a gap that should never have been left undefended. 13 minutes that would raise questions about how a nurse fought like infantry and why no one had known to ask before the attack came. She collected her spent magazines and stood on unsteady legs. Blood continued running from her nose, and the shrapnel cuts on her arm showed through torn uniform sleeves. The aid station waited across 40 meters of open ground, filled with casualties who needed treatment more than she needed rest. Vance secured her rifle and began walking back toward the medical facility. Behind her, the Western Gap remained empty except for the concrete barrier and the brass casings that marked where someone unexpected had held a line that everyone else had forgotten to defend. Vance pushed through the aid station door at 1945 hours, her uniform torn and bloodied, shrapnel wounds visible on her left arm. Lieutenant Kim looked up from where she was organizing triage supplies, her eyes widening as she took in Vance's condition. 3 wounded soldiers already occupied treatment spaces, their injuries ranging from blast trauma to shrapnel wounds similar to what marked Vance's exposed skin. "You need treatment first," Kim said, moving toward her with gauze and antiseptic already in hand. "Those cuts are still bleeding." Vance shook her head and moved past Kim toward the most severely wounded soldier on the center table. The man's leg showed arterial damage, his uniform soaked with blood despite the hasty tourniquet someone had applied during evacuation. She began cutting away the fabric to access the wound properly, her hand steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. Kim grabbed Vance's shoulder with enough force to stop her movement. "Listen to me." You've been in combat for 13 minutes straight. You took a mortar blast, and you're bleeding. Let me treat you, then you can help with the others." The firmness in Kim's voice penetrated Vance's combat focus. She allowed the lieutenant to guide her to a side examination area, though her eyes remained on the arterial bleed across the room. Another medic arrived and took over that patient, his hands immediately working to control the hemorrhage. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Kim asked as she cleaned the shrapnel wounds with careful efficiency. "Morrison said you held the Western Gap alone, against 6 hostiles." Vance flinched as antiseptic bit into torn flesh. "Had some training before nursing school. Standard marksmanship instruction." Kim paused in her work, her expression skeptical. "Standard marksmanship doesn't include holding defensive positions under mortar fire. That's combat infantry skill set." The aid station door opened before Vance could respond. Captain Morrison entered, his uniform showing dust from the defensive positions but no visible wounds. He stopped just inside the doorway and stared at Vance for a full minute while Kim continued treating the shrapnel cuts. "I need to know what I just watched," Morrison said finally. His tone carried command weight rather than casual inquiry. Kim finished bandaging Vance's arm and stepped back, recognizing the conversation required privacy despite the active treatment area around them. She moved to assist with other casualties, leaving Vance facing Morrison across 3 feet of space. "Combat defense of an unprotected sector," Vance replied. "Standard response to identified threat." Morrison moved closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I watched through the observation scope. Controlled fire, tactical movement between positions, precision engagement under pressure. That's not standard anything for medical corps personnel." Vance stood, testing the bandages Kim had applied. They held secure despite the range of motion required for continued work. She met Morrison's eyes directly. "Prior infantry, Marine Corps, 2014 through 2018. Deployed twice to Helmand Province. Left service and retrained as a nurse." The information settled between them like physical weight. Morrison processed it, his expression shifting from confusion to comprehension to something approaching frustration. "You were 0311 Infantry?" Vance nodded once, the confirmation requiring no elaboration. "Why didn't this come up before?" Morrison demanded. 2 deployments, combat experience, infantry training. Why didn't I know this when you arrived at my base?" Vance moved toward the supply cabinet, pulling fresh gloves to continue treating casualties. "Never seemed relevant in medical role. My job is trauma care, not tactical consultation." Morrison followed her movement, positioning himself to block her return to the treatment area. "It became relevant this morning when you tried to warn us about the ridgeline. It became relevant when we ignored terrain assessment from someone with actual combat observation experience." The statement hung between them, acknowledgement without quite becoming apology. Vance pulled on the gloves with sharp motions. "The ridgeline positions engage your rangers exactly as terrain analysis predicted. The Western Gap provided flanking access exactly as defensive assessment suggested. Relevance doesn't require permission to exist." Morrison absorbed the rebuke, his jaw tightening. "Tell me the rest." "Full background. 3 years active duty infantry," Vance said. 2 combat deployments, multiple patrol operations. Marksmanship instructor qualified at Camp Lejeune. Separated in 2018, attended nursing school on GI Bill, enlisted Army Medical Corps 2021. Nothing in that history violated disclosure requirements during integration. "But you maintained infantry readiness," Morrison pressed. "The rifle maintenance, the tactical awareness, the immediate combat response tonight. You stay prepared. Some skills you don't lose," Vance replied. "Some training becomes permanent regardless of current job description." She moved around Morrison toward the casualties who needed attention more than this conversation required. Morrison let her pass, but called after her. "We'll discuss this further in tomorrow's debrief." 0900 hours, Operations Center. This conversation isn't finished. Vance reached the treatment table where a soldier with chest trauma needed immediate intervention. "Understood, sir." She bent to her work, hands already assessing injury severity, while Morrison remained standing near the entrance. The captain watched her for another 30 seconds, observing the practiced efficiency of her trauma care, the same controlled precision she had demonstrated holding the Western Gap against multiple hostiles. Then he turned and left the aid station, the door closing behind him with finality that suggested tomorrow's debrief would carry consequences beyond simple discussion. Kim reappeared at Vance's side, helping stabilize the chest trauma patient for evacuation. "So you were Marine infantry," she said quietly. "That explains the weapon maintenance and tactical observations. It explains why I noticed terrain features and firing positions," Vance agreed. "It doesn't explain why no one asks about background before dismissing input." Kim worked in silence for several seconds, their hands coordinating to prepare the patient for helicopter transport to the regional medical facility. When someone assumes they know your full capability based on your current uniform insignia, asking seems redundant to them. They've already decided what you can contribute. The observation carried accuracy that Vance couldn't dispute. She secured the final bandage and marked the patient for immediate evacuation. The aid station continued its organized chaos, casualties flowing through treatment and stabilization before moving to the helicopter landing zone for transport to higher-level care. Vance worked through the next hour, treating wounds that ranged from minor to severe, her hands performing procedures that nursing school had taught while her mind remained partially engaged with a 13-minute defense that would require explanation tomorrow. Morrison now knew her background, but the knowledge raised more questions than it answered. Why hadn't she disclosed infantry experience during integration? Why had she maintained combat readiness in a medical role? Why had she chosen nursing after leaving infantry? Questions that deserved answers beyond the brief summary she had provided. The Western Gap remained in her thoughts, that 40-meter section of perimeter that should never have been left undefended. Someone with tactical training had identified it. Someone with combat experience had held it. And someone with authority would now have to address why medical personnel were fighting defensive battles while Rangers struggled to understand what they had witnessed. Kim finished treating the last minor casualty and approached Vance at the supply cabinet. Tomorrow's debrief is going to be difficult. Morrison will want details, and the Rangers will have questions about how the nurse held a defensive line they couldn't support. Vance restocked trauma supplies with methodical precision. Combat actions speak clearly enough. The terrain warning was valid, the defensive response was necessary, and the outcome prevented base breach. Details don't change results, but results change perceptions, Kim countered. After tonight, no one will dismiss your input the same way Dalton did this morning. That's its own kind of consequence. The aid station finally emptied of casualties at 2,130 hours. Vance completed her medical logs, documenting treatments provided and patients evacuated. The entry for her own injuries took 2 lines, minor notation in a day marked by combat that had validated warnings no one wanted to hear. The Tactical Operations Center conference room held 14 personnel at 0900 hours the next morning. Captain Morrison stood at the front beside a digital display showing the previous evening's attack timeline, his expression set in formal debriefing mode. Vance sat in the third row beside Lieutenant Kim, while the Ranger team occupied the front 2 rows with Dalton positioned directly in Morrison's line of sight. Morrison began without preamble. Yesterday's coordinated assault on forward operating base Cobra involved 3 separate elements attacking simultaneously at 1902 hours. Southeast vehicle-borne IED, Northwest tower explosive, and attempted infantry breach through the western perimeter gap. He advanced the display to show the base layout with red marks indicating each attack point. The southeast and northwest attacks achieved initial penetration. Morrison continued. We sustained 7 wounded, 2 requiring evacuation to regional medical. The Western Gap assault was completely repelled with 0 friendly casualties in that sector and multiple confirmed enemy kills. He pressed a button and helmet camera footage from the Quick Reaction Force helicopter filled the screen. The aerial view showed the Western Gap from 200 feet up, clearly displaying a single figure behind the concrete barrier, engaging multiple targets with precise fire. The footage timestamp read 1919 hours, 2 minutes before the helicopter's arrival ended the engagement. Dalton leaned forward in his seat, recognition crossing his face as he identified the lone defender. That's the nurse from yesterday's briefing. Morrison let the footage play for another 15 seconds, showing Vance transitioning between firing positions and engaging targets with controlled accuracy. Then he froze the image and turned to face the assembled personnel. Staff Sergeant Elena Vance, currently assigned to Medical Corps. Prior service Marine Corps Infantry, Military Occupational Specialty 0311 Rifleman, combat deployments to Helmand Province, 2015 and 2016, marksmanship instructor qualified. The room absorbed this information in silence. Chun and Brooks exchanged glances, their earlier dismissiveness notably absent. Martinez stared at the frozen image on screen, his expression processing the disconnect between medical insignia and infantry capability. Staff Sergeant Vance held the Western Gap defensive position alone for 13 minutes under sustained enemy fire, Morrison stated. She engaged and neutralized multiple hostiles, prevented enemy penetration into base interior, and maintained position through mortar attack. He paused, letting the tactical significance settle. Without her independent action, the Western Breach would have succeeded while our forces were committed to other sectors. Kim made notes in her notebook, documenting the official acknowledgement for records that would follow. Vance sat motionless, her bandaged arm visible beneath her uniform sleeve, but her expression neutral as Morrison detailed her combat performance. Morrison advanced to the next slide, showing the morning briefing room from yesterday. During yesterday's mission planning, Staff Sergeant Vance attempted to provide terrain assessment regarding the ridgeline observation posts. His eyes moved to Dalton. That input was dismissed as outside medical expertise. Dalton shifted in his seat, the movement drawing attention from the Rangers around him. Morrison continued without mercy. The ridgeline positions that Staff Sergeant Vance identified engaged Ranger elements exactly as her terrain analysis predicted. Those positions provided overwatch for the coordinated assault and pinned our primary response force for the duration of the attack. The silence in the conference room carried weight beyond sound. Morrison had connected the morning dismissal to the evening's near-catastrophic defensive gap with brutal clarity. Every person present understood the implications. Staff Sergeant Dalton, Morrison said directly, "Address your decision to dismiss tactical input during yesterday's briefing." Dalton stood, military protocol requiring acknowledgement despite the discomfort visible in his posture. "She mentioned terrain concern about the ridgeline, sir. I shut her down, told her medical stays in medical lane." He paused, then added with visible effort, "The terrain assessment was accurate. My dismissal was based on job position rather than expertise evaluation." Morrison nodded once, neither accepting nor rejecting the acknowledgement. He turned to address the full room. "This base operates with multiple personnel who bring diverse backgrounds to their current roles. We failed to utilize available expertise because we made assumptions based on current job codes rather than actual capability. That failure nearly cost us a defensive breach." He clicked to a new slide showing personnel policy documentation. "Effective immediately, all support personnel with prior combat military occupational specialties will be consulted during relevant tactical planning. This includes terrain assessment, security evaluation, and defensive positioning regardless of current assignment." He looked at Vance directly. "Expertise exists whether we acknowledge it or not. Our job is to recognize and employ it appropriately." Morrison announced formal commendation paperwork for Vance's defensive action, the words carrying official weight that would follow through channels beyond the immediate unit. He assigned Kim to conduct personnel review across the base, identifying any other soldiers with combat experience in non-combat roles. The debrief continued for another 30 minutes covering tactical lessons and defensive improvements, but the core message had been delivered in the first 15 minutes. The assumption that medical personnel lacked tactical value had been demolished by 13 minutes of combat performance that no one could dismiss or explain away. When Morrison concluded the formal session, the room emptied slowly. Dalton remained in his seat as other Rangers filed out, his eyes fixed on the digital display that still showed Vance's frozen image behind the Western Gap barrier. Vance stood and collected her notebook, preparing to return to the aid station where duties continued regardless of debrief outcomes. Dalton caught her near the door. The words came with difficulty, his voice low enough that only Vance and Kim nearby could hear. "About the briefing yesterday, and the comment when we returned. I was wrong on both counts." Vance met his eyes without hostility, but also without acceptance that would ease his discomfort. Terrain assessment is terrain assessment regardless of who provides it. She moved past him into the corridor, leaving Dalton with his incomplete apology and the knowledge that vindication had required combat that should never have been necessary. Kim followed Vance into the hallway, her notebook filled with documentation that would become official record. That was about as close to a public reprimand as Morrison could deliver without formal charges. She kept pace with Vance's stride toward the aid station. The policy change is significant. Consulting support personnel with combat experience could prevent similar gaps in other units. Vance pushed through the aid station door into familiar territory where trauma supplies waited in their precisely organized positions. The policy changes what gets asked, not what gets assumed. Dalton apologized because Morrison forced acknowledgement, not because understanding changed. Kim settled into a chair near the examination area, her perspective offering counter to Vance's assessment. Understanding changes through experience. The Rangers watched you hold that defensive line. They saw footage of precision fire under pressure. That creates recognition that briefing room dismissal couldn't overcome. Maybe, Vance conceded. She began morning inventory count, her hands moving through supplies while her mind processed the debrief and its implications. Combat performance provided evidence that words never could, but evidence shouldn't have required enemy assault to become visible. The aid station radio announced routine morning traffic, the base returning to normal operations after the previous evening's attack. Patrols departing, perimeter checks completing, supply deliveries scheduled. The rhythm of military life continuing forward with new policies layered over old assumptions. Morrison's formal commendation would enter official channels, documenting Vance's defensive action for records that followed soldiers through their careers. The personnel review would identify other support personnel with unutilized combat experience. The tactical planning process would expand to include voices previously excluded from consideration. Changes built on 13 minutes of combat that had validated terrain warnings. No one wanted to hear from someone whose uniform insignia suggested she couldn't possibly understand tactical concerns. Vance completed her inventory count and prepared for morning sick call. Another day of medical duties, informed by experiences that everyone now knew existed, but few had bothered to discover before assumption met reality under fire. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes reviewed Captain Morrison's incident report at battalion headquarters 40 kilometers from forward operating base Cobra. The document arrived via secure email at 1,400 hours on day 2, its subject line reading Attack After Action Report, with a secondary notation that caught his attention immediately. Medical personnel conducted solo defensive action during coordinated assault. Barnes opened the attached files and began reading Morrison's detailed timeline. The coordinated three-point attack, the defensive response split between sectors, and the Western Gap that should have provided enemy access but instead became a killing zone held by a single defender. He scrolled to the personnel section and stopped at Staff Sergeant Elena Vance's name. The notation beside her name listed current assignment as Medical Corps Trauma Specialist, but Morrison had added a secondary line. Prior USMC Infantry 0311, Combat Deployments Hellman 2015-2016, Marksmanship Instructor Qualified, Purple Heart, Combat Action Ribbon. Barnes pulled Vance's complete personnel file from the system. The Marine Corps records showed honorable discharge in 2018 after 4 years active duty with exemplary performance ratings throughout. Her infantry service included 2 combat deployments with multiple patrol operations and a Purple Heart from an IED incident in 2016. Marksmanship scores in the expert range, leadership evaluations noting tactical awareness and decision-making under pressure. The Army records began in 2021 after nursing school completion. Top 5% academic performance, specialized trauma certification, assignment to forward operating bases where her medical skills were clearly needed. But nowhere in the integration paperwork had anyone flagged her prior combat specialty or considered how that experience might be utilized beyond medical duties. Barnes picked up his desk phone and dialed Morrison's direct line at FOB Cobra. The captain answered on the second ring. "I'm reading your after-action report," Barnes said without preamble. "Tell me why we didn't know we had a combat-experienced infantryman assigned to medical." Morrison's response came carefully. "She never mentioned it, sir. Her personnel file shows prior service, but the system doesn't flag specific combat specialties during branch transfers. She integrated as medical corps and performed medical duties." Barnes pulled up 3 other forward operating bases in his battalion's area of operation and began searching their personnel rosters for similar patterns. "Did you ask about her background when she arrived?" Morrison hesitated before answering. "No, sir. Medical corps personnel are evaluated on medical capability. We don't typically inquire about prior service details unless they're directly relevant to current assignment. Combat experience is always relevant to forward operating base operations," Barnes said. He found what he was looking for in the personnel databases. 2 more soldiers at FOB Python with prior infantry experience now serving in supply roles. Another at FOB Viper who transferred from armor to logistics. He expanded his search parameters and the pattern became clearer. "Stand by," he told Morrison, then put the call on hold while he conducted broader analysis. 12 personnel across his battalion with combat military occupational specialties now assigned to support roles. Engineers who had served as combat engineers. Logistics specialists with prior artillery experience. Communications personnel with infantry backgrounds. 12 soldiers whose combat expertise was being completely ignored because their current jobs didn't require it. Barnes returned to Morrison's call. "I'm finding a systemic pattern here. Multiple personnel across the battalion with combat experience that we're not utilizing." He pulled up the Western Gap defense footage that Morrison had attached to his report. "Your staff sergeant held a defensive position for 13 minutes because she had the training to do it. How many other defensive gaps exist because we're not asking the right questions about who can fill them?" Morrison absorbed this. The debrief this morning included policy change requiring consultation of support personnel with prior combat specialties. But that's local to FOB Cobra unless you want to expand it. Barnes drafted an email to brigade headquarters while maintaining the phone connection. "I'm expanding it to battalion level immediately, and I'm recommending brigade implement it across all units." He attached Morrison's after-action report along with his own analysis showing the 12 identified personnel. This isn't about one soldier in one incident. It's about how we're wasting expertise because our personnel systems don't connect prior experience to current needs. He scheduled a visit to FOB Cobra for day 4 to personally interview Vance and review Morrison's implementation of the new consultation policy. The conversation with Morrison concluded with directives for comprehensive personnel review and interim guidance, requiring tactical planners to consider all available expertise regardless of current job assignment. Barnes sent his email to Brigade Commander Colonel Hammond with priority flagging, then began drafting battalion-wide policy guidance. The Voluntary Expertise Registry concept took shape as he wrote, a system allowing personnel to register prior combat specialties and choose which types of consultation they were willing to provide. Some soldiers left combat roles for valid reasons and shouldn't be forced back into tactical planning, but their expertise remained valuable if they chose to offer it. By 1600 hours, he had drafted a complete policy framework. Personnel with prior combat military occupational specialties could register voluntarily, indicating areas where they were willing to be consulted. Tactical planners would be required to review the registry during mission planning and consider relevant input. The system respected both the expertise soldiers brought and their choice about how that expertise was employed. Barnes reviewed the policy once more, thinking about the Western Gap and the 13 minutes that had prevented catastrophic breach. How many other gaps existed across his battalion? How many other Staff Sergeant Vancess were organizing supplies or processing paperwork while their combat experience gathered dust in personnel files nobody examined? He transmitted the policy draft to his staff with implementation deadline of 30 days. The response came within the hour as his operations officer and personnel officer began identifying all personnel who would be affected. The initial count reached 47 across 8 forward operating bases, though the number would likely grow as records were examined more carefully. Barnes called his subordinate commanders and briefed them on the new requirements. Some expressed confusion about why support personnel needed involvement in tactical planning. Others immediately grasped the implications after hearing about Vance's defensive action. By the end of day 2, every forward operating base in the battalion had received preliminary guidance and begun their own personnel reviews. The visit to FOB Cobra would occur on day 4 as scheduled. Barnes wanted to meet Vance personally to understand why she had maintained infantry readiness while serving in Medical Corps, and to hear her perspective on how the voluntary registry system should function. Her choice not to disclose her background suggested complexity beyond simple oversight. He reviewed the helmet camera footage again, watching the precise fire and tactical movement that had held the Western Gap. The footage showed capability that years of training had developed and continued practice had maintained. Somewhere in the transition from Marine infantry to Army nurse, Vance had made decisions about which skills to keep sharp and which to let fade. She had chosen to maintain combat readiness even when her job no longer required it. That choice had saved forward operating base Cobra from breach. But Barnes recognized it shouldn't have required enemy assault to reveal expertise that proper personnel management should have identified and utilized from the beginning. The system had failed, and the systemic failure extended across his entire battalion and likely beyond. Barnes drafted his final email of the day to Colonel Hammond of Brigade, summarizing the battalion-wide review findings and formally requesting expansion of the Voluntary Expertise Registry to all brigade units. The justification section referenced Vance's defensive action but emphasized the broader pattern of unutilized combat experience across multiple installations. He hit send at 1,730 hours, knowing the brigade commander would recognize both the immediate tactical implications and the longer-term cultural shift required. The military had always valued combat experience, but somewhere in the transition to peacetime manning and specialized job assignments, that experience had become compartmentalized and forgotten. Vance had reminded them through 13 minutes of combat that expertise doesn't disappear just because someone changes uniforms or job descriptions. The lesson had been expensive, purchased with enemy assault and near-catastrophic defensive breach. Barnes intended to ensure the lesson spread beyond FOB Cobra before other units paid similar prices for similar assumptions. Day 4 would bring his personal visit and interview with the staff sergeant who had sparked battalion-wide policy change through actions she probably never wanted to take. But first, 30 days to implement a registry system that recognized what should have been obvious from the beginning. Every soldier's experience matters when forward operating bases face enemies who don't care about job descriptions or organizational charts. Day 3 began with Dalton approaching the aid station during Vance's morning shift. He stood outside the entrance for 10 seconds before entering, his hesitation visible through the window where Lieutenant Kim organized medical supply requisitions. Vance looked up from documentation work as he crossed the threshold, his ranger uniform showing fresh dust from the morning perimeter check. About the briefing, Dalton began, then stopped. His hands moved to his sides, then crossed, then returned to neutral position. The discomfort in his posture spoke louder than his incomplete sentence. Vance set down her pen and faced him directly. Terrain concern was valid. That's what matters. The deflection cut off whatever apology Dalton had prepared. He stood silent for 3 seconds, processing her professional dismissal of his personal attempt at reconciliation. "Right," he said finally. "Terrain assessment." He turned to leave, paused at the door, then exited without additional comment. Kim watched the exchange from her position at the supply cabinet. He came to apologize, and you shut him down. Vance returned to her documentation. Apologies don't change what required 13 minutes of defensive fire to prove. She completed the medical log entry and moved to prepare for morning sick call. The shift in base culture became visible throughout the day. Chun and Brooks arrived for routine physical assessments during mid-morning, their previous dismissiveness replaced with genuine curiosity. They asked about Vance's infantry experience during the examination, questions focused on Helmand Province operations and patrol tactics rather than medical procedures. "What made you transition to nursing after combat deployments?" Chun asked while Vance checked his blood pressure. Most infantry either re-enlist or leave the military entirely. Vance documented the normal reading before responding. "Combat showed me what happens when trauma care arrives too late. Nursing offered opportunity to be the person who arrives in time." Brooks nodded understanding. "Makes sense. Losing people to preventable injuries hits different than combat losses." He hesitated, then added the Western Gap defense. That was pure infantry discipline under pressure. No wasted movement, no panic fire. "Training becomes permanent," Vance replied. "Some responses bypass conscious thought when situations demand immediate action." She completed their assessments and cleared them for full duty, the medical interaction professional despite the tactical conversation underlying it. Martinez appeared during afternoon hours, requesting consultation on an upcoming patrol route through terrain similar to Coast Valley. He spread a map across the examination table, his approach lacking the dismissiveness that had characterized previous ranger attitudes toward medical personnel. "We're planning movement through this valley system," Martinez explained, pointing to topographical features. "Looking for input on observation post locations and potential ambush sites." Vance studied the map with practiced eye, identifying elevated positions and natural choke points. 3 locations offered tactical advantage to defenders. She marked them with precision, adding notes about effective engagement ranges and likely approach vectors. "This ridge provides overwatch for 2 kilometers of your route. These rock formations create natural firing positions with protected withdrawal options." Martinez documented her observations carefully. "This is exactly the kind of assessment we should have requested before yesterday's patrol." He rolled up the map. "Morrison's new policy makes sense when you see what we missed by not asking." The acknowledgement carried more weight than Dalton's uncomfortable apology attempt. Martinez recognized the professional value rather than simply processing personal guilt over dismissal. Vance provided additional tactical considerations, their discussion spanning 15 minutes of detailed terrain analysis that drew on her Helmand Province experience. Lieutenant Kim observed the cultural shift across the base throughout Day 3, documenting interactions for the personnel review Morrison had assigned. She found Vance in the aid station during evening hours and shared her observations. "Support personnel are being included in planning discussions now," Kim reported. Supply Sergeant Torres revealed he was former 11B infantry with 2 deployments. He's attending tomorrow's tactical briefing to provide logistics assessment from combat perspective. Vance cleaned examination equipment, her movements methodical. "Torres served with the 101st, she said. Afghanistan 2012 and 2014. His combat logistics experience includes resupply under fire and convoy defense." Kim's eyebrows rose. "You knew about his background?" "We've discussed it," Vance confirmed. "Several support personnel have combat experience they don't advertise. The system never asked, so they never mentioned it." This revelation expanded Kim's understanding of the systemic pattern. "How many others are there on this base alone?" Vance paused in her equipment cleaning. "At least 6 that I'm aware of. Engineers with combat engineering background, communications specialists with artillery experience, administrative personnel with prior infantry service. Different paths led them to support roles, but the combat training doesn't disappear." Kim added notes, to her documentation. This is bigger than Morrison realized. The personnel review is going to identify significantly more affected personnel than initial estimates suggested. The base dining facility conversation that evening reflected the changing dynamics. Vance sat with Kim, while rangers at the adjacent table discussed the upcoming voluntary expertise registry that Barnes was implementing battalion-wide. Their conversation acknowledged the value of consulting experienced personnel regardless of current assignment. Dalton joined their table without invitation, sitting across from Vance with determined purpose. Second attempt at addressing the morning briefing, he said, this time without deflection. Vance set down her fork and gave him full attention. I dismissed your terrain assessment because of your uniform insignia, not because of your observations merit, Dalton stated. That was professional failure on my part. The ridgeline positions engaged us exactly as you predicted. The Western Gap required defense you provided alone because I never considered that medical personnel might have tactical capability. The admission came with visible effort but genuine acknowledgement. Vance recognized the difference between uncomfortable apology and professional recognition of error. Terrain assessment requires observation experience, she replied. Combat deployments provide that experience regardless of current job assignment. Your dismissal reflected systemic assumptions rather than individual failure. Dalton absorbed this perspective. Morrison's policy change makes those assumptions harder to maintain. Consultation requirements mean we ask rather than assume. Torres approached their table, carrying his meal tray. Mind if I join? The supplies sergeant's question included everyone present, his easy confidence suggesting comfort with the cultural shift occurring around them. Vance gestured to the empty seat. Torres served with the 101st. His logistics experience includes combat resupply operations and convoy defense tactics. Torres settled into his chair. Heard about the voluntary registry system Barnes is implementing. Planning to register for logistics planning consultation and convoy security assessment. He looked at Vance directly. Your Western Gap defense reminded everyone that current job doesn't define total capability. About time the system recognized that formally. The table conversation expanded to include tactical discussion among people whose current assignments range from medical to logistics to infantry, but whose combined experience covered multiple combat deployments and specialized training. Kim documented the interaction as evidence of cultural change taking root at ground level. Rangers at adjacent tables participated in similar conversations, their previous certainty about who possessed tactical expertise giving way to recognition that expertise existed throughout the base if anyone bothered to identify and utilize it. The shift wasn't complete and resistance remained among some personnel, but the direction was clear. Vance completed her meal and prepared to return to the aid station for evening shift. The 13 minutes of Western Gap defense had created ripples extending beyond immediate policy changes. Personal interactions were evolving, professional relationships were being redefined, and assumptions about capability based on uniform insignia were becoming harder to maintain. Dalton caught her near the dining facility exit. Tomorrow's patrol through that valley terrain Martinez showed you. Would you be willing to provide pre-mission briefing on the observation post locations you identified? Vance considered the request. Time permitting around medical duties, yes. Terrain analysis takes 15 minutes maximum. Appreciated, Dalton said. He returned to his table while Vance exited into the evening air. Kim followed her across the compound toward the aid station. That was significant. Dalton requesting your tactical input represents complete reversal from his briefing room dismissal. Reversals mean less than sustained change, Vance replied. Tomorrow's consultation request matters if it continues beyond this week. Cultural shifts require time and repetition to become permanent. The aid station waited with its precisely organized trauma supplies and the familiar rhythm of medical duties that continued regardless of tactical discussions or policy changes. Vance pulled on fresh examination gloves and prepared for evening sick call, another shift in the role that defined her current assignment while combat experience that everyone now knew about informed everything she observed and understood about this forward operating base and the threat surrounding it. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes arrived at Forward Operating Base Cobra via helicopter at 1,000 hours on day 4. Captain Morrison met him at the landing zone, both officers moving quickly away from the rotor wash as the aircraft lifted off for its return flight to battalion headquarters. The August heat already pressed down with intensity that made the short walk to the operations center feel longer than its actual distance. Morrison briefed Barnes during the walk. Staff Sergeant Vance is currently on shift at the aid station. I've arranged for private meeting space in my office at your convenience. Barnes carried a folder containing Vance's complete personnel file, along with his drafted voluntary expertise registry policy. Show me the western gap first. I want to see the defensive position she held. They diverted to the perimeter where concrete barriers marked the 40-meter gap between defensive positions. Blast damage from the mortar round remained visible on the barrier surface, and spent brass casings littered the ground behind the primary firing position despite cleanup efforts. Barnes studied the sight lines, the available cover, and the approach terrain that 6 insurgents had attempted to exploit. Single Defender held this against multiple hostiles for 13 minutes, Barnes stated. The tactical geometry of the position made the achievement more impressive rather than less. Limited cover, multiple approach angles, exposure to indirect fire. This required exceptional skill under extreme pressure. Morrison pointed to the secondary firing position 3 meters away. She moved between positions to prevent enemy from fixing her location. Controlled pairs, precision engagement, tactical discipline throughout. The helmet camera footage doesn't fully capture how difficult this defense was. Barnes photographed the position from multiple angles, documentation for his report to brigade that would support expanded implementation of the expertise registry. Then he followed Morrison to the operations center where the captain's office provided privacy for the scheduled interview. Vance arrived 10 minutes later, her medical corps uniform showing the professional appearance expected, but her bandaged arm visible beneath the sleeve. She entered Morrison's office and stood at attention until Barnes gestured to the available chair. "Sit please," Barnes said. "This is conversation rather than formal inquiry." He opened Vance's personnel file and reviewed the summary page. 4 years Marine Corps infantry with 2 combat deployments, expert marksmanship, leadership ratings consistently excellent. Then separation, nursing school, and Army enlistment in medical corps. Help me understand that transition. Vance settled into the chair with the controlled posture of someone comfortable with command presence but uncertain about the conversation's direction. Combat deployments showed me the difference between timely trauma care and evacuating remains. Nursing offered opportunity to be on the side that saves lives rather than takes them. Barnes absorbed this perspective, but you maintained infantry readiness. The rifle maintenance, the tactical awareness, the immediate combat response during the attack. You didn't leave those skills behind. Some skills become permanent regardless of career changes, Vance replied. Training to that level creates responses that don't fade even when daily duties shift to different areas. Barnes leaned forward slightly. Did you deliberately choose not to disclose your infantry background during Army integration? The question hit directly at the decision Barnes needed to understand. Vance took 3 seconds before responding. I disclosed prior Marine Corps service as required. The integration paperwork didn't request specific military occupational specialty details, and I wanted fresh start focused on medical career rather than combat history. That's honest answer, Barnes acknowledged. He pulled out his drafted registry policy and placed it on the desk between them. I'm implementing voluntary expertise registry across the battalion. Personnel with prior combat specialties can register and choose which types of consultation they're willing to provide. The key word is voluntary because I recognize some people left combat roles for valid reasons. Vance reviewed the policy document with careful attention to the voluntary participation framework. This respects both the expertise and the choice. Some soldiers shouldn't be forced back into tactical planning if they separated from combat roles for personal or medical reasons. Exactly my thinking, Barnes said. Your perspective on implementation would be valuable. How do we design this system to maximize utilization while respecting individual boundaries? The question shifted Vance from interview subject to policy consultant. She considered the framework before responding. Make it optional for all consultation types rather than a Lornathing participation. Someone might be willing to provide terrain assessment, but not convoy security planning. Granular choices allow people to contribute where they're comfortable. Barnes made notes on his policy draft. Consultation categories with individual opt-in for each category. That's excellent refinement. What else? Allow people to change their registration status, Vance continued. Someone might need to step back from consultation temporarily due to medical issues or personal circumstances. Flexibility prevents the system from becoming another mandatory duty that defeats the voluntary purpose. Barnes added this to his notes as well. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, covering implementation details, communication strategies, and potential resistance points. Vance's input refined the policy framework significantly. Her dual perspective as both effective personnel and tactical expert, providing insights Barnes hadn't considered. Morrison contributed observations from FOB Cobra's early implementation experience. The cultural shift has been rapid, but not universal. Some personnel still resist consulting support staff on tactical matters despite the new policy. Others have embraced it completely. The middle group seems to be waiting to see if the change is genuine or temporary. That's predictable resistance pattern, Barnes said. Cultural change takes sustained leadership commitment. He looked at Vance directly. Your defensive action provided undeniable evidence that expertise exists beyond traditional combat roles. That evidence makes resistance harder to justify. Vance's expression suggested discomfort with being framed as example or symbol. I responded to immediate tactical necessity. The broader implications weren't part of my decision process during those 13 minutes. But the implications exist regardless of your intentions, Barnes replied. 47 personnel across my battalion have prior combat experience being ignored. Your actions forced us to recognize that systemic failure. Now we're implementing corrections that should have been in place from the beginning. The conversation shifted to Barnes's request for Vance's assessment of other support personnel at FOB Cobra who might have unutilized expertise. She identified 6 individuals by name with their prior specialties and potential consultation areas. Torres with his logistics and convoy experience. Communications specialist Wright with artillery background. Engineer Thompson with combat engineering expertise. 3 others with various combat specialties now serving in administrative or support functions. Barnes documented each name along with contact information for follow-up interviews. The pattern confirmed his broader analysis. Every forward operating base likely had similar hidden expertise waiting to be recognized and employed. Why didn't these people disclose their backgrounds? Barnes asked. The question wasn't accusatory, but genuinely curious about the systemic factors preventing expertise identification. Vance considered her response carefully. Some wanted fresh starts and new roles. Others assumed combat experience wasn't relevant to current assignments. Many simply weren't asked and saw no reason to volunteer information that seemed unrelated to daily duties. The system creates silos where prior experience gets filed away and forgotten. Morrison added his perspective. We evaluate medical personnel on medical capability, logistics personnel on logistics performance, communications specialists on communications proficiency. Combat experience becomes invisible when it's not part of current job requirements. Barnes closed his notebook and stood, the interview transitioning to conclusion. Staff Sergeant Vance, your input has been invaluable for refining this policy. The Voluntary Expertise Registry will launch battalion-wide within 30 days. He extended his hand, and Vance shook it with firm professionalism. I'm also processing Captain Morrison's recommendation for formal commendation of your defensive action. That paperwork will follow through channels with my full endorsement. Thank you, sir, Vance replied. She stood and moved toward the door. pausing when Barnes called after her. One final question. Would you register for tactical consultation under the voluntary system? Vance turned back to face him. Yes, sir. Terrain assessment and defensive planning categories. Combat experience has value when employed appropriately. Barnes nodded satisfaction. That's exactly the response I hoped to hear. Dismissed. Vance exited Morrison's office and returned to the aid station, where morning sick call continued regardless of battalion commander visits or policy discussions. Barnes remained with Morrison for another hour, reviewing implementation plans and discussing leadership strategies for sustaining cultural change beyond the immediate aftermath of dramatic combat action. The helicopter returned at 1,300 hours to transport Barnes back to battalion headquarters. He carried documentation that would support brigade-level expansion of the expertise registry, along with refined policy framework incorporating Vance's consultation. The flight back gave him time to draft his formal recommendation to Colonel Hammond, emphasizing both the immediate tactical benefits and a longer-term cultural shift required. 47 personnel across 8 forward operating bases represented significant unutilized capability. Vance's 13-minute defense had revealed the cost of ignoring that capability. Barnes intended to ensure the lesson translated into permanent systemic change rather than temporary policy adjustment that would fade when the immediate crisis passed into memory. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes's report reached Brigade Commander Colonel Hammond on day 5, arriving via secure channels with priority classification that demanded immediate attention. Hammond reviewed the document in his office at Brigade Headquarters, the attached video footage from FOB Cobra's Western Gap defense playing on his monitor while he absorbed the tactical and systemic implications. The footage showed precision fire from a lone defender holding position against multiple hostiles under mortar attack. Hammond had commanded combat units for 23 years and recognized exceptional performance when he saw it. But the defender's current assignment as Medical Corps personnel created cognitive dissonance that the report's details explained through Barnes's thorough analysis. Hammond read Barnes's personnel review findings with growing concern. 47 support personnel across battalions, 8 forward operating bases with prior combat, military occupational specialties, 12 with infantry experience, 8 with artillery backgrounds, 15 combat engineers, 7 with armor specialization, 5 communications personnel with various combat roles, all currently serving in support assignments with their combat expertise completely unutilized. The report documented 2 additional incidents where support personnel had offered tactical input that was dismissed. At FOB Python, a logistics specialist with prior artillery experience had suggested adjustments to indirect fire support planning and been told to focus on supply chain management. At FOB Viper, a communications specialist with infantry background had identified potential observation post-vulnerabilities during security review and been excluded from further planning discussions. Neither incident had resulted in combat action validating the dismissed input, but the pattern matched FOB Cobra's near-catastrophic defensive breach. Hammond recognized systemic failure when evidence accumulated across multiple installations and units. He picked up his phone and called Barnes directly. Your report on the expertise registry. I'm reading implementation timeline of 30 days for battalion. That's too slow. I want brigade-wide implementation within 25 days. Barnes's response came without hesitation. Understood, sir. I'll coordinate with other battalion commanders immediately to accelerate their personnel reviews and registration system setup. Hammond continued reviewing the report while maintaining the call. Your documentation shows 47 affected personnel in your battalion. Extrapolating across 4 battalions suggests approximately 200 personnel brigade-wide. That's significant unutilized capability. The numbers are conservative, Barnes replied. Those figures represent only clear matches in personnel databases. Thorough interviews will likely identify additional personnel with relevant experience that wasn't properly documented during integration processes. Hammond made notes for his staff meeting scheduled later that afternoon. I'm directing Brigade S1 to conduct comprehensive personnel review across all units. Your voluntary registry framework will be the implementation model. He paused, considering broader implications. This extends beyond tactical consultation. We're talking about cultural shift in how we value and employ experience. The conversation continued for 15 minutes, covering implementation challenges, resistance management, and metrics for measuring success. Hammond committed brigade resources to support rapid deployment of the registry system, including additional personnel officers to assist with reviews and database setup. After concluding the call with Barnes, Hammond reviewed 2 other documents on his desk. An intelligence summary noting increased insurgent activity across the region, and a logistics report detailing equipment shortages affecting defensive capabilities at forward operating bases. Both documents suddenly seemed more manageable with the recognition that 200 experienced personnel were available for consultation if anyone bothered to ask them. Hammond drafted implementation order for all brigade units, his directive clear and unambiguous. All personnel with prior combat military occupational specialties will be identified within 10 days. Voluntary expertise registry will be operational across brigade within 25 days. All tactical planning activities will include review of registry and consultation with relevant registered personnel. He added an additional paragraph emphasizing the voluntary nature of participation and the requirement to respect personnel choices about consultation areas. Barnes's interview with Staff Sergeant Vance had produced valuable refinements to the framework, particularly the granular opt-in approach allowing people to choose specific consultation categories. The brigade staff meeting at 1,500 hours received Hammond's directive with mixed reactions. His operations officer immediately grasped the tactical advantages. His personnel officer expressed concern about the administrative workload. His intelligence officer asked insightful questions about how to integrate the registry with existing planning processes. Hammond addressed each concern while maintaining focus on the fundamental principle. We have 200 combat experienced personnel whose expertise we're ignoring because they changed job codes. That's unacceptable waste of capability. This registry system corrects that failure. He showed the Western Gap defense footage to his staff, the visual evidence making his point more effectively than words could achieve. One staff sergeant with infantry background held a defensive position for 13 minutes and prevented enemy breach. How many other defensive positions across our brigade would benefit from similar expertise applied before the enemy attacks? The question hung in the room without requiring verbal answer. Every staff officer present recognized their own units probably contained hidden expertise similar to what Barnes had discovered at battalion level. Implementation planning consumed the remainder of Day 5. Hammond's staff developed detailed timelines, assigned responsibilities, and drafted communication plans for subordinate units. The voluntary expertise registry transformed from concept to operational requirement, with specific deadlines and measurable objectives. By Day 8, preliminary personnel reviews across brigade had identified 173 personnel with prior combat specialties. The number would grow as more thorough interviews were conducted, but already the scale exceeded initial estimates. Each forward operating base averaged 20 personnel with unutilized combat experience, representing significant capability that tactical planners had never accessed. Hammond received incident reports from 2 other battalions describing similar dismissal patterns. At FOB Falcon, a medical technician with prior combat engineering experience had identified structural vulnerabilities in defensive barriers and been excluded from the engineering assessment team. At FOB Hawk, an administrative specialist with artillery background had offered fire support coordination suggestions during planning sessions and been told to remain in administrative lane. The reports documented cultural patterns that extended beyond individual personalities or isolated incidents. Systemic assumptions about capability based on current job codes had created organizational blind spots across the entire brigade. Day 12 brought Hammond's scheduled visit to FOB Cobra to present formal commendation and observe the registry implementation firsthand. The helicopter flight gave him time to review Barnes's latest update showing battalion registration numbers. 31 of the 47 identified personnel had registered for various consultation categories, a participation rate exceeding 70% that suggested genuine interest rather than reluctant compliance. Forward Operating Base Cobra appeared below, its perimeter defenses clearly visible from altitude. Hammond identified the western gap where Staff Sergeant Vance had conducted her defensive action, the position now reinforced with additional barriers and clear fields of fire that should have existed before enemy assault tested the defenses. The helicopter touched down at 1,100 hours, and Captain Morrison met Hammond at the landing zone. They walked together toward the formation area, where the entire base complement had assembled for the formal ceremony. Hammond had conducted hundreds of commendation presentations during his career, but this one carried unusual significance. The recognition wasn't simply for exceptional combat performance, though that alone warranted formal acknowledgement. The commendation represented institutional recognition that expertise existed throughout the force regardless of current uniform insignia or job assignment. Staff Sergeant Vance stood in formation among Medical Corps personnel, her position and ranks reflecting her official assignment rather than the infantry background everyone now knew existed. Hammond would call her forward, present the Army Commendation Medal with Valor device, and make remarks that addressed both her individual action and the broader systemic changes her defense had precipitated. The ceremony would formalize what 13 minutes of combat had proven, that assumptions about capability based on job codes were dangerous organizational failures. That expertise existed throughout support ranks if anyone bothered to recognize and employ it. That cultural change required leadership commitment backed by policy implementation and sustained emphasis. Hammond reviewed his prepared remarks one final time as Morrison assembled the formation. The words balanced individual recognition with institutional message, personal valor with systemic lesson, immediate tactical success with longer-term cultural transformation. 200 personnel across brigade with unutilized combat experience. 12 forward operating bases that would benefit from their consultation. Countless potential defensive gaps that could be identified and addressed before enemy assault tested the vulnerabilities. The Voluntary Expertise Registry would launch brigade-wide within 13 more days, meeting Hammond's accelerated timeline. Barnes's battalion had led the way, Morrison's FOB Cobra had provided the catalyst, and Vance's 13-minute defense had forced recognition of capability that organizational assumptions had hidden in plain sight. Hammond stepped from the operations center into the formation area, where assembled personnel waited in the Afghan heat for ceremony that would acknowledge both extraordinary individual action and the beginning of institutional change that should have occurred years earlier. The formation at Forward Operating Base Cobra assembled under cloudless sky at 1,100 hours on day 12. 143 personnel stood in ranks organized by unit assignment, Medical Corps personnel on the left flank, Rangers in center formation, support specialists and logistics on the right. The precision of their alignment reflected the discipline expected for formal ceremonies, though the August heat already challenged that precision with sweat-darkening uniform collars. Colonel Hammond stood at formation front beside Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Colonel Barnes, the three officers representing brigade, battalion, and FOB command levels. Behind them, the Western Gap remained visible in the distance, its concrete barriers now reinforced with additional defensive positions that closed the vulnerability Vance had defended alone. Staff Sergeant Elena Vance stood in the second rank of Medical Corps formation, her bandaged arm still showing evidence of shrapnel wounds sustained during the mortar attack 10 days prior. Lieutenant Kim stood beside her, having delayed her stateside rotation to witness the ceremony and complete her personnel review documentation. Morrison called the formation to attention, his voice carrying across the assembled ranks with the authority that came from leading combat outpost operations. Colonel Hammond will now address the formation. Hammond stepped forward, his prepared remarks balanced between individual recognition and institutional message. On the evening of day 1, Forward Operating Base Cobra sustained coordinated three-point assault designed to overwhelm defensive response through simultaneous attacks. Southeast Vehicle-Borne Explosive Device, Northwest Tower Blast, an attempted infantry breach through the western perimeter gap. The assembled personnel remained at attention while Hammond detailed the tactical situation, most having experienced the attack firsthand but hearing command-level perspective for the first time. The southeast and northwest attacks achieved initial penetration and created the conditions enemy forces intended. Our defensive response split between crisis points exactly as their planning anticipated. The Western Gap, left temporarily undefended during initial response, provided the breach opportunity that would have allowed enemy access to base interior in catastrophic tactical situation. Hammond paused, allowing the tactical assessment to settle before continuing. Staff Sergeant Elena Vance, currently assigned to Medical Corps as trauma specialist, independently identified the undefended gap and moved to establish defensive position. For 13 minutes, she engaged multiple hostile forces, maintained position under sustained enemy fire, survived mortar attack, and prevented enemy penetration until quick reaction force arrival ended the assault. He gestured to Morrison, who called Vance forward from formation. She moved with the controlled precision of someone comfortable with military ceremony, stopping at prescribed distance and rendering proper salute. Hammond returned the salute, then retrieved the award case for Barnes. Staff Sergeant Vance's defensive action demonstrated exemplary courage under fire, tactical discipline under extreme pressure, and professional commitment beyond assigned duties. Her 13-minute defense prevented catastrophic breach that would have resulted in significant friendly casualties and potential loss of this forward operating base. He opened the case revealing the Army Commendation Medal with Valor device, the Bronze V attachment signifying combat heroism. By authority vested in me as brigade commander, I present this Army Commendation Medal with Valor device in recognition of exceptionally valorous actions during enemy engagement. Hammond pinned the medal to Vance's uniform while the formation observed in formal silence. The ceremony followed prescribed military protocol, but Hammond's next words departed from standard script. Staff Sergeant Vance's background includes 4 years Marine Corps infantry with 2 combat deployments to Helmand Province, expert marksmanship qualification, and marksmanship instructor certification. This expertise remained unknown to this forward operating base until combat action revealed capability that organizational assumptions had hidden. His tone sharpened slightly. That failure is institutional, not individual. The statement carried implications beyond the immediate ceremony. Hammond was addressing the entire formation about systemic problems rather than simply recognizing individual valor. Staff Sergeant Vance represents one of 173 personnel across this brigade, with prior combat military occupational specialties currently serving in support assignments. 173 soldiers whose expertise we have ignored because we made assumptions based on current job codes rather than total capability. He let that number resonate through the formation. Rangers shifted slightly, support personnel stood straighter, and command staff maintained careful attention to Hammond's words. Effective within 13 days, this brigade will implement voluntary expertise registry, allowing all personnel with prior combat specialties to register for tactical consultation in chosen areas. This system respects both expertise and choice while ensuring we employ available capability appropriately. He looked directly at Vance. Staff Sergeant Vance's input refined this policy framework significantly. Her perspective as both affected personnel and tactical expert improved implementation in ways command staff alone could not have achieved. Hammond stepped back and rendered salute, which Vance returned with precision. Dismissed to formation. Vance returned to her position in Medical Corps ranks while Hammond continued addressing the assembled personnel. The lesson from day 1 extends beyond individual heroism or policy implementation. We must fundamentally change how we recognize and value expertise throughout our force. Current job assignment represents one aspect of capability, not total capability. Prior experience and training remain relevant regardless of subsequent career changes. He paused, scanning the formation with command presence that demanded attention. Every person in this formation brings experience and expertise beyond their current duties. Our responsibility as leaders is to identify that expertise, respect choices about its employment, and create systems that utilize capability rather than waste it through organizational assumptions. Morrison called the formation back to attention as Hammond prepared to conclude. This commendation recognizes extraordinary combat performance that saved this installation from catastrophic breach. But it also marks the beginning of cultural transformation that should have occurred before enemy assault forced recognition of our systemic failures. The formation remained at attention as Hammond rendered final salute and stepped back. Morrison dismissed the assembled personnel, and the rigid formation dissolved into individuals moving toward their respective duty stations. Dalton approached Vance as she moved toward the aid station, his rangers following several paces behind. The commendation was earned, he said without preamble. The 13-minute defense was pure combat discipline under impossible circumstances. Vance acknowledged the recognition with brief nod, her comfort with praise limited by personality and the memory of why that defense had been necessary. Chun and Brooks joined them, their earlier dismissiveness completely absent. "The terrain warning you gave in the briefing," Chun said. "We should have listened. The ridgeline positions hit us exactly as you predicted. Past tactical errors matter less than future decision-making," Vance replied. "The voluntary registry system creates structure for consultation without requiring combat validation of expertise." Torres approached from the support formation area, his supply sergeant uniform bearing the same expert marksmanship badge Vance wore. Registered for logistics consultation and convoy security assessment. The system makes it official rather than informal conversation among those who happen to know each other's backgrounds. Lieutenant Kim documented the post-ceremony interactions. Her personnel review now expanded to include implementation assessment for the registry system. The cultural shift she had observed beginning on day 3 had accelerated through formal policy and command emphasis, though sustainability remained question mark beyond immediate aftermath of dramatic catalyst. Hammond remained at FOB Cobra through the afternoon, conducting site visits to defensive positions and meeting with personnel who had registered for expertise consultation under the voluntary system. His presence signaled command commitment that extended beyond ceremony into operational implementation. Barnes accompanied Hammond on these visits, their discussions covering both immediate brigade implementation and potential expansion to division level. The Western Gap defense had created tactical case study with strategic implications reaching beyond single incident or installation. Vance returned to aid station duties after the ceremony, her uniform now bearing additional recognition of capabilities everyone knew about, but organizational systems had failed to acknowledge formally. The Voluntary Expertise Registry would launch brigade-wide within 13 days, creating structure for consultation that 13 minutes of combat had proven necessary. The commendation would follow her through remaining military career, formal documentation of extraordinary action under fire. But Hammond's remarks about institutional failure and systemic change carried implications beyond individual recognition. 173 personnel across brigade with unutilized combat expertise. 12 forward operating bases that would implement consultation systems. Cultural transformation that required sustained leadership commitment rather than temporary policy adjustment. Morrison stopped by the aid station during evening hours. Hammond's remarks about institutional failure weren't subtle. He addressed the entire command structure about assumptions and organizational blind spots. Vance organized medical supplies with practiced efficiency. Recognition of systemic problems is prerequisite for systemic solutions. Individual commendations acknowledge past actions. Policy implementation addresses future capability employment. The practical assessment captured the ceremony's dual nature. Personal recognition for extraordinary combat performance. Institutional acknowledgement of organizational failures that made that performance necessary. Both messages delivered simultaneously to formation that included personnel across the capability spectrum. Night settled over forward operating Base Cobra with the familiar rhythm of perimeter security and routine operations. The Western Gap stood reinforced and defended. The Ridgeline observation posts were incorporated into threat assessment planning, and the Voluntary Expertise Registry moved toward implementation that would formalize consultation of personnel whose capabilities extended beyond current job assignments. Vance completed evening medical logs, documenting routine treatments and minor injuries that comprised most days on forward operating bases where enemy contact punctuated longer periods of operational normalcy. The Army Commendation Medal with Valor Device would be recorded in her permanent file. Formal recognition joining the Purple Heart and Combat Action Ribbon from earlier service. But the cultural shift Hammond had emphasized during his remarks would determine whether 13 minutes of Western Gap defense became isolated incident or catalyst for lasting institutional change across an organization that finally recognized expertise existed throughout its ranks regardless of uniform insignia or current assignment. Day 13 began with Vance returning to normal aid station duties. The Army Commendation Medal now part of her permanent record, but her daily responsibilities unchanged by formal recognition. She treated minor injuries during morning sick call, organized trauma supplies according to her precise system, and maintained medical readiness that had always defined her current assignment. The ceremony had acknowledged capabilities everyone now knew existed, but medical core work continued requiring the same attention and expertise it had demanded before 13 minutes of combat forced institutional recognition. Lieutenant Kim transferred to Battalion S1 on Day 18. Her stateside rotation converted into assignment managing expertise registry expansion across all 4 battalions. She had requested the position specifically, recognizing the voluntary consultation system required careful implementation to succeed beyond initial enthusiasm. Her personnel review documentation from FOB Cobra provided foundation for broader rollout, and her understanding of both the tactical benefits and cultural challenges made her ideal coordinator for the complex organizational change. The Voluntary Expertise Registry went live brigade-wide on Day 25, meeting Colonel Hammond's accelerated timeline through coordinated effort across 12 forward operating bases. Final registration numbers reached 189 personnel, 16 more than preliminary reviews had identified. Thorough interviews had uncovered additional soldiers with combat experience that incomplete personnel files had failed to document during integration processes. Participation rates varied across installations, but averaged 68%. With 129 personnel registering for at least one consultation category. The numbers represented significant capability that tactical planners could now access through structured system rather than informal relationships or chance discovery. Day 30 brought the first measurable security improvement directly attributable to registry consultation. At FOB Python, a logistics specialist with prior artillery experience identified vulnerabilities in indirect fire defense planning during routine tactical briefing. His recommendations led to repositioning of counter-battery radar and adjustment of response protocols. 3 days later, enemy mortar attack targeting that installation was detected and engaged quickly enough to prevent casualties. The improved response directly traceable to consultation that wouldn't have occurred before the registry system existed. Battalion staff documented this success as validation of the voluntary expertise framework. Barnes circulated the report with emphasis on prevention rather than response, highlighting how proactive consultation had addressed vulnerabilities before enemy action tested them. The contrast with FOB Cobra's Western Gap defense was deliberate and instructive. Day 35 saw Dalton leading patrol through Coast Valley terrain, the same route that had passed near Ridgeline observation post during the initial briefing on Day 1. Before departure, he consulted Vance on terrain assessment and incorporated Torres for logistics planning based on his convoy security experience. The patrol executed without contact, but the consultation process represented cultural change more significant than tactical outcome. Rangers were asking rather than assuming, incorporating expertise from support personnel as standard practice rather than emergency exception. Vance provided the terrain assessment in 15 minutes. Her analysis identifying 3 potential observation posts and 2 likely approach vectors for hostile forces. Dalton adjusted patrol route accordingly, maintaining mission objectives while reducing exposure to elevated firing positions. The consultation occurred in the operations center with Morrison present. Formal inclusion of medical corps personnel in tactical planning that would have been inconceivable 5 weeks earlier. Day 40 brought Barnes to brigade headquarters for metrics presentation to Colonel Hammond. The battalion commander carried documentation showing 12 security improvements implemented based on registered personnel consultation, 0 breaches at forward operating bases actively utilizing the registry system, and sustained participation rates above 65%. The numbers demonstrated tactical value beyond anecdotal success stories. Hammond reviewed the metrics carefully before asking the question that mattered most for institutional sustainability. Are we seeing consultation become routine practice, or is this still driven by recent memory of FOB Cobra's attack? Barnes answered honestly. Mixed results across units. Some commanders have fully integrated registry consultation into standard planning processes. Others treat it as additional requirement to be checked off rather than genuine resource to be employed. Cultural change is happening, but not uniformly. The assessment matched Hammond's observations from his own installation visits and conversations with subordinate commanders. Sustained transformation required more than policy implementation and success metrics. It needed leadership commitment that extended beyond immediate crisis memory into permanent operational practice. Day 45 brought unexpected visitor to brigade headquarters. Division Safety Officer arrived to study the Voluntary Expertise Registry for potential Army-wide implementation. The officer spent 3 days interviewing personnel, reviewing documentation, and observing consultation processes at multiple forward operating bases. Her report to Division recommended expanded pilot program across additional brigades, citing FOB Cobra's Western Gap defense as catalyst, but emphasizing the broader pattern of unutilized capability across support ranks throughout the force. The recommendation would take months to work through division and higher headquarters, but the trajectory was established. What began as battalion-level response to near-catastrophic defensive breach had expanded to brigade implementation and now attracted attention for potential service-wide adoption. 13 minutes of combat had revealed organizational failures that extended far beyond single installation or unit. Vance treated minor wound for newly arrived specialist on day 45, the soldier asking routine questions about base operations and medical procedures. During the examination, he mentioned prior service as 11B infantry before retraining as communication specialist. Vance noted this in her documentation and asked casual question, "Have you registered for the Voluntary Expertise Registry?" The specialist looked confused. "What registry?" Vance explained the system allowing personnel with prior combat specialties to volunteer for tactical consultation in chosen areas. The specialist expressed immediate interest, particularly in communication security assessment, where his infantry experience provided perspective that pure communications training lacked. She directed him to Lieutenant Kim's office at Battalion S1. The interaction demonstrating that implementation remained incomplete despite formal policy and command emphasis. New arrivals weren't being briefed on the registry system during integration, and some personnel who would benefit from participation had never heard about the voluntary consultation framework. Vance mentioned this gap to Morrison during their next staff meeting. The captain added registry briefing to standard newcomer orientation, closing an oversight that would have allowed valuable expertise to remain hidden simply because new personnel didn't know the consultation system existed. Day 48 marked the arrival of new medical corps personnel, replacing Vance for rotation to different assignment. Staff Sergeant Shun, no relation to the ranger who shared his surname, arrived with nursing credentials and 3 years Army experience at stateside hospitals. His personnel file showed no prior combat specialty. His entire military career focused exclusively on medical duties. Vance conducted turnover briefing covering standard aid station procedures, supply management systems, and patient treatment protocols. She added information that wouldn't have been included in similar turnover 6 weeks earlier. Multiple personnel on this base have combat experience beyond their current assignments. Rangers will consult you on medical planning, but also be prepared to receive tactical input from support personnel whose expertise extends into areas you might not expect. Chen absorbed this guidance with interest. The cultural dynamic here is different than stateside installations. People operate outside traditional role boundaries. Vance considered how to explain the shift that had occurred. The boundaries still exist, but they're more permeable. Expertise gets recognized regardless of uniform insignia when the system creates structure for that recognition. She gestured to the precisely organized trauma supplies. Combat experience informs everything about how I maintain medical readiness, even though my current job is purely medical. The registry system just formalizes what should have been obvious from the beginning. The turnover continued through day 50, covering equipment maintenance, local threat patterns, and coordination procedures with evacuation assets. Vance's final duty day at Forward Operating Base Cobra arrived with the same routine medical operations that had defined most of her deployment, punctuated by extraordinary combat action that everyone remembered but didn't define daily reality. Torres organized an informal gathering at the dining facility on Vance's departure evening. Rangers attended alongside support personnel, the mixed group reflecting cultural integration that would have been unlikely before coordinated enemy assault forced recognition of capabilities beyond job descriptions. Dalton presented Vance with unit coin, small token carrying significance beyond its monetary value. The Western Gap defense changed how this base operates, Dalton said. The words came easily now, weeks of sustained consultation having normalized what initially required forced acknowledgement. Your expertise prevented catastrophic breach, but your presence afterwards helped transform how we employ everyone's capabilities. Vance accepted the coin and the recognition it represented. Expertise exists throughout every unit. The question is whether leadership creates systems to recognize and employ it appropriately. FOB Cobra did that. The challenge is sustaining the change beyond immediate memory of why it became necessary. The gathering continued for another hour, conversations ranging across deployment experiences and upcoming rotations. Kim attended despite her battalion assignment, having maintained connection to the installation where personnel review work began. The voluntary expertise registry she now managed across 4 battalions had started with documentation of one aid station's defensive action and expanded to system affecting nearly 200 personnel. Vance departed Forward Operating Base Cobra on day 51, helicopter lifting off at dawn for the first leg of rotation back to stateside assignment. She watched the installation shrink below, the Western Gap visible as reinforced defensive position rather than vulnerability that had required solo defense. The ridgeline observation post that had engaged Rangers on day 1 remained in distance. Permanent terrain features that future tactical planning would incorporate because someone with expertise had been allowed to mention them. The Voluntary Expertise Registry would continue operating across brigade, expanding to additional units if division recommendations were approved, potentially reaching service-wide implementation if higher headquarters recognized the same organizational failures that FOB Cobra's near breach had exposed. Cultural change required sustained commitment beyond individual catalysts, but the framework now existed for that sustainability. 13 minutes of Western Gap defense had proven capabilities everyone should have recognized before combat forced the revelation. The commendation documented extraordinary action under fire. The policy changes addressed systemic failures that had made that action necessary. And the cultural shift toward recognizing expertise throughout support ranks would determine whether the lesson became permanent transformation or temporary adjustment forgotten when crisis memory faded. The helicopter gained altitude and turned toward its next waypoint. Behind it, Forward Operating Base Cobra continued operations with registered personnel participating in tactical consultations, support specialists contributing expertise that extended beyond job descriptions, and Rangers asking questions instead of making assumptions about capability based on uniform insignia. Some lessons require extraordinary circumstances to teach. Others should have been obvious from the beginning if organizational systems have been designed to recognize rather than hide the expertise existing throughout military ranks regardless of current assignment. Vance's 13 minutes had taught both lessons simultaneously, proving capabilities while exposing failures in brutal clarity that policy implementation was still working to address weeks later. What assumption have you reconsidered after seeing someone's hidden capability? Share your story in the comments. And if this account of courage that changed culture resonates with you, hit subscribe for more real stories where expertise emerges from unexpected places and transforms how organizations recognize the people they thought they already knew.